The question of Jason Kenney's leadership was supposed to be answered last weekend. It was not, since the party decided to go with mail-in ballots instead. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, can you explain the advantage that Premier Kenney may have going with the mail-in ballots?
Yeah, so basically the way it was supposed to work is you needed to buy a party membership and then you needed to register for this special general meeting that was supposed to be April 9th in Red Deer. It was going to be in-person voting. You went in, you got your pencil and your paper, you filled out your ballot. It was counted. We were going to know the results. There ended up being sort of too many registrants for the convention. They had like 15,000 people, and they thought, well, you know what, we're not going to be able to do it in person. Of course, this is the party line. Critics, have a different understanding of what happened. So what they did is they opened up the leadership review voting to the entire party membership list, which is like 55,000 people, not just 15,000 people. Ballots are now being mailed out to all of those members, and they will all have their say. So what critics say is that this benefits Jason Kenney because he's getting access to this legacy membership, the membership that has been around since the party's beginning, and not just the people who might have signed up with the explicit purpose of going to that special general meeting, which, as you can imagine, are probably largely people who are mad at Jason Kenney. So, the critics of Jason Kenney say, look, 15,000 people, we liked our chances then. But when you go to the whole party membership, who maybe weren't upset enough to sign up for this special general meeting, all of a sudden that maybe looks like it's going to benefit Jason Kenney. Whether or not that is the case, whether or not that pans out, whether or not, these people are going to get their ballots in the mail and return them in time or return them in general, maybe they don't even care. That's a bit of an open question. But given the drama, I do think we're going to see significant response from the UCP membership. And we'll know, I think it's May 18th when all of that is supposed to be done, and then it'll be counted by an auditing firm and the results will be out. But by no means do I think, things are just going to be quiet for the next few weeks. I think we're going to continue to hear quite a bit about this. We've heard a lot about internal party drama over the last year or two, and I don't see that ending anytime soon.
Now, Premier Kenney has been preaching a lot about unity. Like it says in the Bible, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. But will the United Conservatives be united enough to win a second term next year?
Well, and that's sort of what Kenney said on Saturday, because he gave a speech to a sort of broadcast speech to the members who had signed up for the special general meeting. And there were actually people in person in Red Deer, which was a twist that I don't know if anyone really saw coming. And he said, look, this party needs to be unified. Otherwise, it's going to be another Rachel Notley government. And so, I've talked to a lot of Kenney critics who say, look, the party is unified. The issue, the unity issue, is Jason Kenney himself. And obviously, Jason Kenney doesn't, quite see it in the same way. But, I do think it's a bit of an open question whether or not the party survives this, or what kind of shape the party is going to be in after this. There's a scenario you can imagine where Jason Kenney wins a majority of the vote, but not a huge majority. Let's say he comes in at 55% or 60% support his leadership. Is that enough to hold the party together? Is that enough for MLAs within his own caucus who have been unhappy with his handling of the pandemic and other things? Is that enough for them to stick around for another year? Or do they break away? Do they go join Todd Loewen? Do they go join Drew Barnes? What does Brian Jean do? So unless Jason Kenney comes out with like a large majority support, say 75%, I don't think those unity issues go away. I think he can say that the question's been put to the membership and it's been settled. He has majority support. But what is confidence of the party membership? I think that's very much an open question.
We recently had Premier Kenney on Bridge City News, and I asked him specifically, with Brian Jean winning the by-election of Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche, how soon before Jean's punted out of caucus? And he really danced around the question quite a bit. Have you posed the same question to our Premier?
I haven't, but it seems to be that if Brian Jean sort of behaves himself, he'll get to stay in caucus. And so that's a bit of an open question, whether or not he's going to sort of fall in line or if he's going to continue to criticize the premier. Because as we know, the premier has ejected people from caucus previously for criticizing his leadership, Todd Loewen and Drew Barnes. were both ejected for sort of casting doubt on the premier's decision making. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting question. And I think we've talked about before that there's a number of 3 or 4 people. Once they are independents in the legislature, they become their own caucus, which entitles them to some more resources in terms of research funding and things like that. So at that point, they start making a little bit more trouble for the premier. They just have a little more resources. And as any politics watcher knows. Drew Barnes and Todd Loewen, just 2 men sitting as independents, are causing a whole heck of a lot of trouble for the premier.
Tyler, a West Virginia Senator, Joe Manchin, was in Alberta recently to tour the oil sands up in Fort McMurray. He talked about North American energy security, and he says North American oil and gas, some of the cleanest in the world. Could we see more of our energy products potentially heading south of the border thanks to Manchin's visit?
Well, it's not sure what sort of impact one senator is going to have on some of this decision making, although he is a powerful senator. He's the chairman of a resource committee in the United States, I believe. But this is part of this larger conversation that's happening right now because of the war in Ukraine, where people are sort of trying to turn away from Russian petroleum products. And there was obviously the controversy in the United States a couple weeks ago when the Biden administration was looking to Venezuela to sort of fill some of the import shortfall it might have. And of course, Jason Kenney's jumped on this and said, well, look, why doesn't this oil and gas come from Alberta? So there's this whole idea of North American energy security, which is, not a super new issue, I wouldn't say, but it seems to have taken on a new urgency, shall we say, or importance, given the war in Ukraine and the sort of escalating sanctions and bans on imports that we're seeing in Canada and the United States and other parts of the world as well.
But do we actually have the infrastructure to help support the American needs? Apparently they need, 80 million barrels a day? And I think we're able to export, 4 or 5 million barrels a day? So, are we able to maybe build up our infrastructure to accommodate the Americans?
Yeah, well, there's sort of 2 issues here. I mean, the first one is our export capacity, because of course the Keystone XL pipeline was sort of scrapped in January 2020. So that's part of the problem, the takeaway capacity. How much are we able to take at the moment through the newly functioning Line 3, I think it is. I get them confused sometimes, Line 3 and Line 5, and rail capacity. But the other issue here is actually one of production. And that's sort of, to what extent can oil sands and drilling operations scale up to meet some of this demand? And the energy sector seems to sort of be saying that it's around 200,000 barrels per day that they can up production sort of over the course of the next year. It'll come online maybe in the fall kind of thing. So it's a bit of a forecasting game in that regard, right? You look and say, oh, well, the demand is there now. Is it going to be there in 6 months? Is it going to be there in a year? Which makes upping production maybe a safe bet, but in terms of new projects that might take years to come online, or a pipeline project that might take a couple years to come online, those become, I think, somewhat riskier economic gambles. So there's a whole pile of moving parts here that I think make the issue a little bit more complicated, perhaps, than politicians would maybe like.
Now, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was in Edmonton recently, and he was asked about the future of the Keystone XL pipeline, which essentially died when Joe Biden took office. Tyler, could it potentially be revived?
It's a good question. Joe Manchin had mentioned it, saying that, there might not be a proponent for this project or someone to back it, but that he sort of feels that it's a necessary project. And the Prime Minister was asked about it and said, sort of discussions are ongoing. We're always talking to the U.S., but it's a decision, that sort of the ball's in their court. It really is up to the Biden administration if they're going to try and revive something like this. So, what does one take from that? That's not an unequivocal answer from the Prime Minister that he's bullishly pushing for Keystone XL. It is perhaps an acknowledgement that these discussions have happened. He took a lot of flack back in January 2020 for a perceived lackluster response to the scrapping of the pipeline. And so he's talking a little bit about it, but I don't really know what a person takes from that. So I wouldn't say, oh, this means there's a good chance Keystone's coming back. I don't think that's true. But this project is perhaps not as dead in the water as some of the others that we've lost in recent years, Northern Gateway and Energy East. So I don't know what you take from that, but it does show, I think, how large this project still sort of looms in Alberta's memory, and also to some extent, I think, in the minds of some politicians in the United States. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that I believe Joe Manchin is a Democrat, not a Republican, which is, just another twist, I guess, on the saga.
Now, with our Prime Minister in Edmonton recently, he also criticized Alberta with regards to our province's response to the opioid crisis. What issues did Trudeau have?
He basically said that the government is not following the science, that the provincial government is not following the science. And the provincial government, the UCP, has been somewhat hostile to supervised consumption sites. The project in Lethbridge, for example, has been very controversial. There's been issues around the Sheldon Tumor Center in Calgary. And what they've done is that they've poured a lot of money into recovery-oriented opioid things, getting people into therapy and rehab and those sorts of things. And they've put up some roadblocks, let's say, that might be overstating it a bit, to accessing supervised consumption sites. For example, you need an ID and a health card now or you will. I'm not 100% sure if that's come into effect, but that's been really controversial. That if you're going to go use drugs, you'd need this documentation. That actually was fought through the courts, and the folks that went to court lost, and the government won that. But anyways, the prime minister is basically saying that they're not following the science by opting for this recovery-oriented approach instead of a harm reduction approach. And this was criticized quite strongly by a press secretary for Mike Ellis, the addictions minister, saying that Trudeau's comments were a joke and shameful, and pointing to the money the government's put into recovery. So you can see very different philosophical approaches to the issue there. But it's been a parallel crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic that has maybe got not as much attention as it deserves. The numbers came out not that long ago, and something like 1,700 Albertans died last year from drug overdoses, and about 1,600 of them, about 91%, were related to opioid poisoning. So, very, very much a live issue, and very different political approaches, shall we say, to tackling the crisis.
Tyler, Conservative Party of Canada leadership candidate Pierre Poilievre is visiting Alberta right now to some very large and rambunctious crowds here. Now, more than 5,000 attended a recent rally at Spruce Meadows in Calgary. Many people may not realize this, but Poilievre is originally from Calgary.
Yeah, so he's not just an Ottawa area MP. He's sort of jetting off to Alberta to try and win support. I've said a number of times over the years that no matter what the path is to becoming prime minister, at least part of that road is through Alberta. This is very much the Conservative heartland, and it's very important, I think, that leadership candidates spend time out here, because almost every seat in the province goes to the federal Conservatives. Same with Saskatchewan. You saw that with Aaron O'Toole. He launched his leadership campaign in Calgary and was in Leduc, I think, a day or two later to sort of boost his campaign. So very important, and Poilievre, a very, very clear front runner, getting huge support. Substantial support all over the country and in Alberta in particular. And it's probably notable that, what waves has Patrick Brown and Jean Charest made out here? Not very many, I think, is the answer to that.
No, exactly. And Poilievre talked about the fact that he grew up in Shaughnessy. He graduated from UFC, so he has strong Alberta roots, definitely. Tyler, the Rural Municipalities Association of Alberta has officially come out against the UCP proposal of ditching the RCMP in favor of a provincial police force. What was the reasoning?
Well, they basically said they haven't seen the evidence that this is going to lead to better policing and is going to save money. Those are sort of the two issues that the rural municipalities are concerned about. This proposal goes back a long, long ways. You can find this in the firewall letter to Ralph Klein in 2001 or 2002. This was part of the Fair Deal Panel's report from 2-ish years ago. So the government is, they're approaching this as a way for some more independence from Ottawa, but they've also looked to the rural crime wave and concerns that have been raised in rural municipalities about the perception that there's been a lackluster RCMP response. And they're saying, look, well, why don't we have a provincial police force that's more responsive to local concerns, that has people, with more attachment to the community, those sorts of things. And the government has also said it's going to save money, which is at minimum a debatable claim, because the federal government, under the RCMP arrangement, foots part of the bill. If we had a provincial police force, that wouldn't be the case. So it really comes down to money and the evidence of whether or not the policing would be any better. And Jason Kenney has sort of said there's going to be more consultation, but he's sort of still sticking by the argument that this is maybe a good thing for the province. So this feels to me like a discussion that's going to really be put off until the next election. They're going to work on it in the background, but I wouldn't expect any major moves in the next year, and it could maybe become something of a ballot box issue for some voters.
Dr. Dina Henshaw, our province's top doctor, testified recently at a civil lawsuit involving 2 churches and 3 people that sued the province in December of 2020 over COVID-19 measures. Tyler, it's the first time she's testified.
It is. So a bit of an odd case, of course, because they sued back in December 2020, and it's just come to court in the past week or two, which says a lot about how quickly the court system works. Because of course the pandemic measures are almost entirely gone. But it was notable because yeah, she hasn't testified in person before and was put to the question by lawyers. Not a whole lot of details that we haven't heard before, if I'm being frank. She answered a lot of the same questions that journalists have asked, that critics have put to her. But still very interesting to see her on the stand and answering those questions. And the other thing that's of note is that there is a current live legal issue in that case right now, and that's whether or not she can answer questions that may be covered by cabinet confidentiality. So, for example, journalists have asked a number of times, what advice did you give cabinet on COVID-19, and did they accept your advice or did they choose something else? That's a question she has dodged by saying that would violate cabinet confidentiality. The lawyers for the plaintiffs, the churches and the individuals, want those questions answered in court. So we don't have answers yet on whether or not those will be sort of public answers or whether or not they will be kept private for cabinet confidentiality reasons. So that's just a thing to watch, because of course if the judge says Hinshaw can answer those questions, well, that's going to be the first time we've heard answers to that, or whether or not cabinet told her to back certain measures. So, interesting that she's testifying for the first time, but also there is the possibility we will get some answers to these questions that we haven't actually got answers before. So remains to be seen what will be happening there, but very interesting to watch nonetheless.
Now, Tyler, we only have about 30 seconds left here, but I wanted to ask you about this question specifically. Dr. Verna Yu, the president of AHS, was abruptly let go last week. The NDP claimed that she'd been fired, while others said she was pushed out over her objection of more privatization of services. What really happened?
Well, we don't know. That's sort of the problem here. We don't know if it was over privatization. We don't know if, as some have implied, that it was resistance to the government's COVID-19 decisions. We do know that her contract was up in about a year, and the government's saying they just sort of started the process early. But one of those things where a little bit of transparency, I think, would maybe neuter some of the opposition's attacks and sort of explain to Albertans what the heck happened here.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for your time today.
Always a pleasure, Hal.